Since finishing Tales of Arise, I spent a few days adrift without a game to focus on, aimless in my endeavours and flitting back and forth to a few MMOs I played in the past. Each time I logged on, I would run around the city in which I spawned idly, but generally lacked the motivation to do anything like a dungeon or raid. The PS5 version of Scarlet Nexus, an anime-inspired JRPG, came to my rescue for just shy of £30. The official tagline on the box is "Discover a brainpunk future plagued by a deadly threat and arm yourself with psionic powers to save the world." For the most part, that tells you everything you need to know about the story. Scarlet Nexus begins as a by-the-numbers anime affair. You play as a teenage warrior recruited to fight monsters. You're given a choice of which story you want to play through, with the options of either the male Yuito or the female Kasane, and depending on which story you choose to start with, you'll get a slightly different version of protagonist joins elite fighting force to combat everyday threat to life in idealistic city-state. These plots interwove with each other in a way that reminded me strongly of Resident Evil 2, where both Leon and Claire go their separate ways but keep stumbling into each other, eventually staggering to the same ending. The early game itself was very much a straightforward good versus evil tale. Anime teens yay, alien monstrosities boo. Then, just before you reach the 4th chapter, the game does something a bit unorthodox, and wrecks the illusion that this is going to be a standard hero anime. Mystery and intrigue start to creep in from the edges, and the plot picks up from there. It's not quite a masterpiece, but the story's certainly interesting where it can be, and keeps enough anime tropes and stereotypes to attract the kind of audience it needs to. The overall concept of the fighting force that both Yuito and Kasane join is that humans with brain powers use them to combat alien invaders who come down from a mysterious formation above the Earth's atmosphere to feast on the brains of humans. The OSF, a fighting force called the Scarlet Guardians because of the red glow that comes out from them when they use their powers, are tasked with hunting the invaders, known only as the Others, and stop them carrying out these attacks on humanity. Those who have a high aptitude for using these brain or psionic powers are drafted into the force from a young age, while others volunteer to join. In essence, both Kasane and Yuito's stories go in search of the truth behind what the Others are, and ultimately look to save humanity from the threat, before the two paths join for the final act. The characters here are pretty much the usual culprits. There's the childhood best friend who secretly loves you, the technical and talented introvert, the mature, stable one, the sarcastic loner, and the self-centered elitist. There are a handful of variations on other standard tropes, but none really stand out. That said, the protagonists are by far the weakest characters, and by a long margin, and improve massively when you're not in control. I chose to do Yuito's story first, and when you control him, he's passive, naive, trusting to the point of disbelief, and he gets over horrific events that should affect him emotionally far too quickly. Meanwhile, Kasane feels cold, distant, powerful. She's this unreachable ideal of a soldier, built to thrive in a harsh world. Her motives might be less clear, and her actions are shrouded in mystery, but this help gives her character a sense of identity and intrigue. On the flip side, when you control Kasane, she's admittedly a better protagonist, but her fixation on her sister for the first few chapters is the sort of unhealthy attachment a therapist would thrive upon. Obviously, there's a storytelling reason for this, but it felt lathered on thick, like the writers were incredibly desperate to make sure that even the kids at the back of the class who weren't paying attention knew that Kasane loves Naomi. Her character has very little in the way of identity outside of this fact, and that hurts her character greatly. Conversely, while playing her story, Yuito comes across much better. He's presented as caring, willing to throw away his family's honor in turn for a sense of justice. It's easier to see why those who follow him do, and it's a stark contrast depending on the perspective you have. Towards the end of the game, both characters come together and team up to fight the final threat, and here is where they both shine. They're definitely entities that were designed with each other in mind, to act as counterbalancers. Kasane is the yin to Yuito's yang, and vice versa. The game also does a pretty good job of promoting side characters in Bond episodes, which are introduced to help flesh out the unique traits and identities of these individuals. They're mostly storyboard interactions where the protagonist sits down and talks about something dear to the support character's heart. These are helpful and work wonders for the characters you team up with on your chosen playthrough. But as the plot unfolds later, some characters' inclusions become more baffling than ever. While playing one story, you can have spoken to a character for all of about 3 seconds, 4 chapters ago, and then all of a sudden you have to fight said character to the brink of death, and then they appear as a Bond episode? I mean, I literally had barely any idea who some of these characters are, and yet they're presented as these companions you're supposed to have a close relationship with. There's also a very specific character on Kasane's side of the story whose motives are never made clear, despite having had to fight her 3 different times throughout the campaign. A lot of these design decisions make more sense when you view Kasane and Yuito's individual stories as 2 halves of a whole meant to run parallel to each other, but unfortunately that payoff doesn't arrive until after you've finished one of the characters' narratives and are midway through the second. Much like the story itself, combat is a slow burn that takes a while to really get going. I've rarely encountered a system that feels so incredibly restricted early on, and moves like dodging, jumping, running, and entering an attacking combo all feel disjointed from each other. There always felt like too long a gap between your combo ending and you being allowed to perform another move, particularly for a game that's designed around fast-paced and highly reactive combat. Cancelling out of animations with jumps and dodges works fine, but there's too much dead space. You can press a button like jump and have very little in terms of options from there. You just sort of hang in the air after making a lame 2-hit combo, lamenting the fact that you have no other moves or abilities to use from there. I'm not asking to get my entire character kit the moment I hit new game, but this was a really slow burn. It took ages to get going. Comparing this to late game combat, where you've unlocked a lot of things and have much more options, it's night and day. Late game combat is really fun, and once you've unlocked extended combos, combat is incredible. Yuito excels with powerful melee attacks on the ground, while Kasane's throwing knives allow her to have an aerial presence that makes flying others trivial. By the time you've dumped 30 plus points into your skills, this game actually feels really good. You feel like you can fight any enemy well and perform a lot better on the battlefield. All of my earlier criticisms no longer apply. It just took a lot longer than I've liked to reach that point. In particular, unlocking powerful abilities like Brain Crush and Brain Drive, as well as a full contingent of SAS abilities unlocked via the Bond episodes, do make this game really fun to play, but that was about 10 hours into the game. And while I'm on the subject, there's also a couple of issues with the camera in combat, particularly if you're fighting in an enclosed space. The game is clearly designed with large arenas in mind for your characters to run around and remain mobile, but some areas, particularly within the abandoned hospital, feel claustrophobic and limiting. These were thankfully rare and can usually be compensated for by dodge spamming out of a corner, but it did break the immersion somewhat. It's true that maybe I'm being unfair, as I'm comparing the game to other action combat inspired titles that probably had more focus on the combat itself and less on the narrative, but for a game released after the launch of the PS5 and the Xbox Series, this feels decidedly last gen, and I say that with quite a bit of generosity. That brings us nicely on to technical performance. This is a cross-generational title, with copies of the game available on the Xbox One, Xbox Series, PS4, PS5, as well as PC. I did think the Switch was a strange omission, but the more I spent time playing the game, the more I thought to myself, yeah, this probably wouldn't feel that good on a handheld console. That said, this isn't particularly graphically or mechanically demanding, and there's nothing present here that particularly feels like it would need the juice of a high-powered gaming PC or one of the newer consoles. As such, I expect this runs quite well on the PS4 and Xbox One, but I didn't get a chance to try it. On the PS5, this runs pretty much flawlessly. I noticed no frame drops during my time with it, and the loading times were short, if not spectacular. Saving does appear to take longer than I would expect it to, particularly when compared to the loading times, and while I'm aware that reading data is often quicker than writing it, the discrepancy here was certainly noticeable. Scarlet Nexus also has a strong foundation in gameplay fundamentals. Things like the gear system and the character progression system work well. They aren't convoluted and require a spreadsheet to master, and gear goes hand in hand with character abilities that are unlocked via the bond system. This allows you to boost a character's natural strengths or compensate for their weaknesses. Everything is really well woven together and works quite cleanly, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that the weapons have different skins. Equipping a new sword or a knife or a gun does show a different model, and there are cosmetic and visual options that can be added to each character, like backpacks, headsets, masks, and the like. These don't serve any function outside of cosmetic, but do allow for a bit of customization for these characters. That said, gear and weapons are mostly gated by story progression, and can be unlocked by exchanging data dropped from fallen foes and found in the world, or by purchasing the item outright with the game's currency. You'll likely have to use a bit of both systems if you want to keep your characters fully geared without doing a little bit of extra grinding, but the game does give you enough to at least keep your combat team up to date if you just stick to the critical path. Scarlet Nexus also features a handful of side quests, but these are exclusively MMO-style fetch or kill quests, with slight variations that feel so systematically generated that they're essentially lifeless. Most of these involve killing specific enemies in specific ways, and you usually have to go out of your way to do these. It's somewhat unlikely you'll accidentally complete them while doing other things, which made the thought of doing them slightly less appealing. Scarlet Nexus is by no means special, but that doesn't mean it's bad. The game is a solid anime JRPG that has a fun action combat if you stick around long enough to unlock the skills that let it be so. The standard difficulty is quite hard compared to what I would call the normal difficulty, but clearly knows what type of gamers are likely to be playing this, and it caters to them well. The story has a satisfying conclusion and ultimately features some twists and turns worth sticking around for, but it struggles to land some of its biggest emotional punches. It's unlikely to attract many new people into this genre of games, and does feel very similar to other Bandai published titles. I will say it hangs on to enough charm and originality that it's definitely worth your time. It has a lot in common with the Sword Art Online series outside of the mainstream anime appeal. I would definitely recommend it, particularly if you're somebody who's a fan of the art style.